Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Insiders and Instigators, a look back at women in transition's history. This event is part of our ongoing celebration of Women in Transition's 50th anniversary. Tonight, we have a group of WIT's former collective members and staff who are going to share about their experiences and the work of their colleagues and collaborators. With us tonight, we have Carolyn Kott Washburne, who helped found Women in Transition and was one of the first staff members hired. We have Miriam Cohen, who was another early staff member and worked at WIT from 1971 to 1975. We have Linda Resnick, who co-directed WIT from 1975 to 1982, alongside Lynne McMahon. We also have Lynne McMahon, who co-directed WIT from 1975 to 1982 with Linda Resnick and was executive director from 1982 to 1988. We have Roz Dutton, who was the director of personal counseling and worked at WIT from 1977 to 1982. Jeanne Marecek, who was an active board member from 1979 to 1986, and Roberta Hacker, who was the executive director of WIT from 1988 to 2016. In addition to our formal panelists, we also have two attendees who we'd like to give special shout outs to for the roles that they played in helping shape and form women in transition. Joan Hubbard was founder of WIT and on the original task force and helped WIT get its first ever grant. Carolyn L Whitaker, former director of community services from 1975 to 1982, was instrumental in the development of the 24-hour hotline at Women in Transition. When she arrived, the phone line was being answered for a few hours, a few days a week. She spearheaded the project to create phone counselor training, recruitment of volunteers, coordination of staff, basically every aspect of the hotline, which is the foundation of all of our services. So for those two friends in the audience, if at any point either of you would like to add something to the discussion, please message Maggie, who is listed as Women in Transition, and we can elevate you to panelists so everyone can see you and hear you. Towards the end of the event, we're going to be asking questions from the audience. So please type your questions into the Q&A box so they don't get lost in the chat. Feel free to make any other kinds of comments that you'd like to make right into the chat box. Okay, so we're going to get started. And I thought that we'd start with the elephant in the room. So this is a panel of white female folks. Does this reflect your experiences during different periods of Women in Transition's development? And were there any discussions or initiatives at WIT to address issues of race, class, and other social identities?
Do you want us to just jump in?
Yeah, please do.
When I was at Women in Transition, seems like that's all we talked about. We talked about issues of class. We talked about issues of race. There were women of color on our staff, and the differences among us were prominent. And we argued about things, and we learned from each other. And it was a very challenging time to be working in a collective where people did not see eye to eye.
Does anyone from a different period of WIT's history want to build or add on that?
I can say that racial equity was very, very important throughout everything that I certainly did at WIT. And it was always an issue of looking for absolute balance. And I'm pretty proud to say that I think that we did maintain a pretty balanced racial composition of the agency. And I'm pretty sure it still is. So that was always very, very important. And I think it was a carryover from our founders.
And I think that continued after the collective left, as Linda and I worked on a more structured organization. And we had in service on racial issues, and we always had women of color who were in leadership or important positions in terms of programming. So I think that that's one of the many threads that goes through the 50 years of Women in Transition, sometimes better, sometimes not so great,
Mhm.
but it is a thread of concern and care.
I remember when I was serving on the board, basically in the 1980s, we talked about this on the board all the time, and wrung our hands because it was so, at that time, it was quite difficult to recruit professional staff. I mean, I think the educational institutions in the city of Philadelphia really stepped up to train more people who'd been trained as social workers and counselors and so on. We also talked a lot about us having a Spanish-speaking staff member to do counseling. And as I said, I mean, we talked a lot and did what we could. The board had, during my time period that I remember, I don't remember every board member, but I remember an African-American man and an African-American woman on the board. We also paid attention to that. That was something that was important to us.
We also paid attention to any consultants that we hired or people that we listened to, like Beverly Harper, who was involved with us for many years and kind of not only kind of related to the community, but also taught us how to market ourselves and sell a little bit. And we kind of, which was harder for us to do than to just take care of things, and take care of people.
So we've noted a couple of people here, but I know that there were many women of color who made incredible contributions to women in transition. For example, also helped create the PCADV Women of Color Caucus and engaged in local organizing and outreach to communities of color. Does anyone have a story about a specific colleague, collaborator, or comrade that they'd like to share? Someone they'd like to shout out?
I'd like to shout out to Winona Sharp, who's no longer with us. She was on the hotline. She was the backbone for a good long time until she passed away. And she was absolutely a joy to work with. I'd also like to shout out to Taliba Broughton, who was a hotline coordinator for some time, and a trainer and a public speaker. Excellent, excellent. And there are a couple other people that slip my mind right now, but I can come back to them.
I'd like to shout out to Jennifer Fleming.
Yeah,
She
I
was
was
a-
gonna do the same thing. You go.
Oh, she was a white woman, and she taught me a lot about growing up in a lower class community. She called it that, a working class community, and brought to the fore always issues of women of color and that their needs were different and we had to address them. It was in our face all the time because of Jennifer. And she's not with us, but her spirit really does live on for me in the early days of women in transition. And there she is.
Let's put it, Jennifer, in the middle.
And just as an aside, Carolyn and I never, ever mentioned wit.
Mhm.
Never. We were always women in transition. To this day, actually, we talk about women in transition. I don't know when wit came to the fore. Anyhow, I mentioned Jennifer with much love and affection and respect.
She eventually changed her name to.
Yes, she did.
To Aisha Pei.
Aisha.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and she was very active and supportive of the African American community and also the Muslim community, and she taught us a lot, and definitely learned to listen. That's for sure.
But Jennifer learned to listen, or we did?
We did. I don't think she did.
No.
I'm not sure. I can't speak for her. Very good question.
Another shout out to Melanie Shaw Taylor, who was at WIT for many, many years and made many contributions. I remember when we made our first presentation to United Way, we all dressed up. And they were, I think, shocked at how articulate the staff was, and they were several African-American women who were so strong in their presentation and dispelled the fact that we were loose hippies.
Loose hippies?
Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
there were questions about us being a member of United Way.
yeah. The way Jennifer wanted us to present ourselves to the world was braless.
I'm sensing there were some divisions in
Yes,
how
there were
we're
some
going to promote
divisions.
feminism.
Yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
we're going to come back to that a little bit later.
Okay.
Does anyone else have a shout out they want to share?
I just wanted to say that at some point we had a training on the idea of supporting each other, how staff members could support each other. And so Carolyn Whitaker and I became what she always says, we're dyads forever. So we were a dyad and supported each other a lot when I was working there, and we've seen each other off and on over the years, but it was really important for each of us to get support, and we were a great black and white pair.
And I want to shout out to the West Philadelphia Mental Health Association, who actually helped to fund us in the years that Lynn and I were co-leading, and helping us, kind of get into their social work community and try to educate the social workers there about issues that we knew about. And Lynn and I, we did this training on abuse, on women in abuse, later on in the 70s. So yeah, we got a lot of support from, and we'll talk about Women's Way later, but we had a lot of support from the funding community, from William Penn and the Philadelphia Foundation. So yeah, some institutions actually supported us, not just individual women. And I guess I want to shout out Judith Brigham. Brigham became Judith Strewstone. And her training, when I went to training with her on how to be a women in transition kind of co-facilitator, she was my leader, and she was the leader. And my God, she was so advanced. I was just like coming out of the suburbs and she was out. It was like so exciting to become a part of the feminist world in a more broad way. And she helped to do that. Besides, she was in love with Bruce Springsteen. And so.
All right. Thanks for the shout outs. So the next thing that I want to do actually is to sort of introduce Women in Transition's original incarnation through video. So we're going to watch a short clip from a program called Woman, which was one of the spots on the book tour that I'm going to ask Carolyn to talk a little bit more about later. Maggie, do you have the clip?
Give me a thumbs up if you can hear the sound.
Divorce. My guests, Jennifer Fleming and Carolyn Kott Washburne. Carolyn and Jennifer are both founding members of Women in Transition. Women in Transition is a Philadelphia program that provides survival skills and emotional support to separating, divorcing, and single-parent women. Ms. Fleming and Ms. Washburn are among the authors of Women in Transition, a handbook on separation and divorce. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Sandy.
Can you tell me a little bit about Women in Transition and how it got started?
We started in 1971 when a group of us were working at the Women's Liberation Center in Philadelphia. We were getting a lot of calls from women who were thinking about separating or divorcing, women who were already in the midst of that process, or who were being beaten by their husbands and wanted to know what to do about that. Many of us had been through separation and divorce ourselves and could be sympathetic on the phone, but we decided we wanted to provide more concrete service. So we got together, started planning, were able to get some foundation funding, and have been going ever since. Right now we have two primary services. One, emotional support, which takes the form of small groups where women get together and talk about what they're going through. And we also provide paralegal counseling.
So now we've heard a little bit about what the original services were. So I'd like to know a little bit more about where Women in Transition started out and how it was organized.
Okay, and that would be me. Miriam can chime in here too. Let me just say, so as you heard me say many, many years ago, that, and can you believe those collars we were wearing? Oh my Lord. Fashion faux pas, oh boy. So yeah, the Women's Center was getting a lot of calls that they just didn't know how to handle. So a group of 8 of us called ourselves the Task Force on Battered Women and developed this program. To take you back to the bad old days, in 1970, there were only 2 grounds for divorce nationwide, either adultery or mental cruelty. The notion of irreconcilable differences didn't exist. Also, the notion of a displaced homemaker didn't exist, but that term just wasn't there. And if the term battered women was being used, it was not being used very widely. So we had our work cut out for us. Yes, we were in, as Miriam said, a dilapidated building. I think of it as 48th and Chester, but anyway, which is where the Women's Center was. And we had a big room, the 2nd floor. It was an old, Victorian house, and we had the 2nd floor room in the front, which is a very nice space for the groups that we ran. So, and Zoe, what was your other question?
How was it organized? How was the original Women in Transition project?
Okay, well, here's the good news and the bad news. We were a collective, meaning there was no executive director and there were no clerical workers, and there was certainly no mail room. We were the mail room. Because we believed that hierarchical structures really work to the detriment of women. So the good news is that we made a lot of decisions collectively, and it was a lot of work, no doubt about it. But we really felt it was important not to slot people into roles that would sort of get rigidified. So the other thing that we did is there were a number of people on staff who had formal education, and we really worked to recruit women who did not, but had a lot of life experience, so that we could, it was essentially doing paraprofessional training on the job. So that's how we were organized.
Thank you. So we heard a little bit about the initial programs. Would you or Miriam like to expand on that, or to show us some of those other publications from the early times of Women in Transition?
Well, it was a very creative time for the collective. We produced the support groups, which have been mentioned before. We refined them. We started every support group with Helen Reddy singing "I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar." And every time Carolyn and I hear the tinkle of that piano as that song starts, we just jump right back to 1971. But those support groups became a model for other groups around the country. And we wanted that to happen. We wanted to train other women's groups in leading these kind of support groups. We also gathered therapists from around the Philadelphia area and developed a therapy referral list so that we could refer our women to these therapists. That group became the Women's Therapy Collective, and I think it's still going on today. It has a different name now. We also wrote up a brochure called How to Find a Therapist and educated women about how to do that. And then there was the Survival Manual, a self-help book, which became, Carolyn's holding up the first book. And then that became the Women in Transition Feminist Handbook, which Carolyn worked mightily on, I would say. And we went on professional book tours, and that was a source of conflict in our collective. Who was going to go, and what were you going to wear, and how did you speak, and could you go on national TV? It was no small feat to organize that. But it was a creative time for all of us. It was also a challenging time, how to keep going financially. We didn't have steady funding. What we had was unemployment insurance. So Station A, if any of you had to go to an unemployment office, was the first place you went to when you were signing up for unemployment. And Station A was our friend. We just assumed, yeah.
And let me just add, they've been asked to bring in funny moments for women in transition. And I'm going to say that unemployment office was our friend. One time, Jennifer, because you had to go in physically and stand in line and wait my day was Monday, and you had to have written down 3 jobs that you'd applied for. Jennifer Fleming got so angry once, she stomped out, kicked the door on her way out. Well, it was glass and it shattered. And so that was federal property. She beat it out of there real quick.
So during the time that I was on staff, I too was going through a separation and a divorce, and I needed to make a living. I needed an income. And it was really difficult for me to go to Station A. It wasn't a survival income at all. So it was a sacrifice for many of us to continue working. I mean, even though we were on unemployment, let me say, we showed up at the office every day.
Right.
Yeah. So I'll stop there if you want to say any more, Carolyn.
No, I'm good.
Early days.
I will just say our very first grant was from the United Methodist Women. I think it was $5,000. It seemed like a princely sum at the time. And I can't remember anything else about subsequent grants. I don't think we ever took government money. I think it was just beating the bushes and drawing on contacts, but shout out to the United Methodist Women.
I want to add that when you were showing the manuals, Carolyn, there are 2 people on this as participants, Susan Daly and Betty Begletter. Both were very much involved in both of those, writing both of those manuals, which was a chore because I know it was done in 1 year on all volunteer time. Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
What are you showing us, Carolyn?
And we also developed a manual for self-help groups, separation and divorce, that we could distribute so that other counselors or other organizations could implement that model.
Right.
And I remember I was trained when the collective was going on unemployment. And at some point, because I was writing I think Jeanne Marecek was helping me write a proposal to get funding for women in transition. And Carolyn announced that I could be on staff half-time. And when if they got money, would I please buy socks that were the same and red? Because I had 2 pairs of green jeans and unmatched socks.
So
and we also
money.
we also continued with unemployment being our funder as we grew and went through many periods of kind of financial distress. And we really just talked to everybody and said, who could afford to do this and who can't and who can go on. And so the trend, it wasn't as it is today with United Way.
So Linda, speaking of funding and transitioning to maybe a slightly more stable source of funding, could you talk about, now that we've gotten past our very early days and stretching what we have and being on unemployment, how did we build a more stable source of funding?
Well, this was another, if you want to call it, feminist approach. Each agency in Philadelphia, women's agency, was going after the same pool of money and kind of competing with each other. So a very Winnie Schofer from Choice and some of the other bastions of women's power in Philadelphia got together and decided to try to fund a coalition. And that became Women's Way. And we had some clear rules that we would share the money equally when we raised it equally, and that one agency person and one board member would be on the board, and that it wouldn't be taken over like United Way with outside lawyers and business people, that we would control it. And that was one of our sustaining kind of directions. And it's interesting, I was thinking about the agencies. It was Women's Law Project. It was WAR, Women Against Rape, Elizabeth Blackwell, Choice, and Options for Women. Of those, three of the groups still exist, half of them. So it did help us get through some very hard periods. So that was some of the funding. And I can talk about CETA later, but the CETA program came well after United Way. And that was, I wrote a question to you all about, that was one of our positive negatives. We got CETA funding for displaced women, and that was a government grant, and it was passed in through the federal government. And we then doubled, we got it, we were thrilled, we doubled our staff. We got training for some of these, for us all, in leadership development from PNC through the support of Bob Schoonmaker, and then his wife, Harriet Hankin, who joined the board. And within a year and a half, the grants were pulled back federally. And so there we were. We had grown, we had doubled in staff, doubled in budget. And the big learning for us was never to do that again. Never get into a situation where you have half of your livelihood from one source. But it did help us get more experience and, for a short time, do more in displaced homemakers. And that was a politically correct word to say, that we were divorced women and that we that we were abused. And that was kind of a nice way the government accepted that terminology.
We eventually actually published another manual as a result of that project of, gosh, I can't remember the name of the manual now, that was designed to teach people how to help women get back into the workforce. And it was a very powerful manual, as were all of ours, but that in particular was pretty phenomenal.
I believe the images that we're showing right now were part of that project, that we're helping displaced homemakers figure out what they might want to do for a career. Does anyone remember utilizing this tool?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
The job puzzle?
Oh, the job puzzle. Huh. I remember staff using it, but I myself never used it.
So it sounds like this CETA grant led to a real change in the structure potentially of women in transition. Was that a point where it became more formalized and hierarchical, or did that happen before or after that time? And how did staff respond to that change?
Well, it started when we received the community mental health funding, because in order to receive that, we had to be a more structured organization. And also, what staff? I think that the structure, obviously, as we grew, the structure had to grow too.
Lynn, when did Women in Transition first establish a board of directors? And who was the first chair of the board?
1980.
No, because I was on the board in 1979, Yeah.
But I think I could be wrong, Lynn, you'll have to check me on this one, but I think when we joined the United Way, we really had to make a board of directors.
Right.
And so I think it became a formal board of directors then. And before then, it was an advisory board.
Right.
Yeah, I
Right.
think we had to have it even when we got the CETA money, so
Uh-huh.
that we had to start to look more acceptable.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you were
And more
wearing
traditional.
bras then.
Well, we didn't shave under our arms, come on, nor our legs, you know.
You gotta have
Some are legs,
some
some are-
standards.
What'd you say, Carolyn?
You have to maintain some standards, you know.
That's right, that was one of them.
Feminist standards.
Right.
Also remember that the CETA grant was taken away at the beginning of the Reagan administration. And it was just one big shock.
And that's when we decided that we had to consider, when it got taken away, then we were in big financial problems. And that's when we had to consider whether we could continue with Women's Way, or we were being approached by United Way. And we had this big, heartfelt decision. We wanted to support the community. We wanted United Women's Way, but they wouldn't, they were not comfortable with dual memberships at that time. And we had to make a hard decision and apply to United Way and leave our sisters in Women's Way.
I have a question for those of you who came after. When we started, everything was free. We did not charge for anything. So is it now a fee for service model? And if so, how did you shift to that?
During our time, it was a sliding scale. If somebody could pay, and it was all on honor system.
Okay.
I don't know what it is.
That was just for, Roz, you might remember this, for the counseling service. Everything else was free or no cost. And I think most of the people that came for counseling were probably paying practically.
That's right. That's, yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Did we ever write anything about how to find a divorce, how to get a divorce? Didn't we write something about that?
Well, it's a separation and
Self-help.
support.
Yeah, but then there might have been a little manual or something that we might have done to help women figure out how to get a divorce. Because you remember in those days, it was hard, and self-help divorces were starting, and some lawyers were really gouging, and some women couldn't get divorces because they couldn't even afford it.
I think the how-to is in the manual.
Yeah, there's a big legal section in here.
Yeah.
And we also
I don't know that all of our women would have gotten the book, so I'm wondering if we had a little simple.
Well, we gave this thing away for free, I'm sure.
That one, yes.
Yeah. We also started a pro se divorce clinic, pro se meaning for yourself.
That's
so
right.
that
That was it.
women could, take that over. Yeah.
I mean, somewhere in that time period, divorce law was changing. Like there was a time when there was no such thing as a no-fault divorce. A judge had to grant you a divorce, and the judge, I say, had to decide whether the grounds were sufficient or you should just suck it up and go on. I think it's also important to say that as late as 1975, there was no state in the United States that had such a thing as marital rape. That is, marital rape was always an exemption to rape laws. In other words, your husband could not rape you. I mean, legally could not rape you. You couldn't bring charges of rape against your husband. And that certainly would have impacted on the experiences of women who came to women in transition because they were experiencing violence in their relationship. And it probably also impacted on what could happen in divorce proceedings. I can't remember.
Marital rape actually didn't become illegal across all 50 states until the early 90s. So that was a very
and
long
by
time.
1980, and before, like from 76 to 80, Women in Transition was working on how to get a no-fault divorce. And so we were instrumental, and we were late. Of course, Pennsylvania was always late. Other states had, that statute, and we did it because some of us all had to go through, like myself, I had I had to have a faulted divorce, and it's painful to do. And when you have children, as Mimi knows, or Miriam, excuse me.
It's fine.
I can't help it. If you leave the relationship even more angry and you have children and you've had to blame your ex-husband for the reason that you're getting divorced, then there's other ramifications with the family and with your children.
When I started at Women in Transition, thank you, Lynn, for hiring me. We were working with the Child Support Project with Women's Law Project, and that became another source of revenue for women who were going through separation and divorce. Because before we started on this project, it was literally hell to go to family court and get any form of child support. And the manual that we wrote and the support groups that was started out in the community was absolutely groundbreaking. It was amazing to see how it changed the lives of so many women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We had a failed attempt of a Widows in Transition program.
Yes.
And that just tells you, when you think about it, the women did not want to, the women who were widowed thought of themselves as better than us who were divorcing, because they still had memories that they didn't choose to be single. So they were not comfortable being at Women in Transition, even though the model made a lot of sense for them too. They did not want to be a part of Women in Transition. And it speaks to the challenges of women, even though you try to work together and you try to, and you try to be helpful, you can't be everything to everybody.
So now I'd like to pivot and ask you a little bit more of a philosophical question. So how did your work at Women in Transition shape your feminist consciousness? And this might also be a place to talk about, the different understandings of feminism within the collective and within the staff. And I haven't heard from Roz, so if you'd like to go first on this question, please do.
Sure. I was just thinking about that. I was, when I started, I was just out of graduate school, although I had some years between college and graduate school, so I wasn't brand new, let's say. But I had also been living outside of the country in the Peace Corps, so I missed a lot of what the beginning of the women's movement was about. I didn't have newspapers or anything to tell me. I was in a village in India. So I really didn't know, and I started learning. I was in a support group earlier. So working in Women in Transition was, for me, the beginning of the practicalities, the realities of feminism, not kind of a theoretical construct, but how the patriarchal system was in fact oppressing and affecting women all over in different ways. So it was a time of my really getting what that really meant, that it wasn't some fluff of, she's what do they used to call women who are feminists, hard, and I can't remember, some term that was kind of colloquial. But anyway, so that's how it grounded my feminism. And the thing that I worked on at Women in Transition the most was starting the counseling program, but also starting groups for abused women. And so I was just inundated with how traumatizing it is to grow up as a woman in this US culture. And it also was because I found out one of my sisters was in an abusive relationship. So it was not only like understanding it with all the women I worked with, realizing, oh, it was in my own family. So women transition really helped my mind go through a revolution, I guess you could call it.
All right, and it looks like Carolyn Whitaker is interested in sharing a few words right now. So we're going to
Hi,
turn
this
to
is Carolyn. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. It's very important for me to share what women in transition meant to me. I came to WIT as a school teacher turned social worker looking for a job. I didn't have a lot of political interest. I needed to pay my bills. However, finding myself immersed in a feminist organization really helped me to begin to look at myself as a woman. Because prior to Women in Transition, it was all about being Black in America, which it still is. However, I had to look at some other things. And I will always, to this day, thank Linda Butts Collins, who in a conversation one day said to me, well, Carolyn, have you read any of the Black authors, the Black female authors? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I felt so dumb. And I don't know 50 years later why I hadn't had the exposure or what the problem was. I went to a HBCU. I was an English major. Why do I know more about Chaucer, Shakespeare, and all those guys, and yet I don't know Audre Lorde and Angela Mai? Just too crazy. But anyway, just out of that connection with Linda, that's how I found Sweet Honey in the Rock. And just so many things that were instrumental to that and informed my being as a Black woman that have been near and dear to me to this day. I suspect when I came to WIT, I was a lot more angry and aggressive than assertive. I learned how to be that too, and politically correct, as well as, what did we say? The personal, the political, and what was the other one? The personal,
Political.
Say it again?
Personal is political.
Yeah, that one. That one. So there were a lot of things that I learned that were instrumental in my becoming who I became over the years as I continued to work, and informed who I am, and allows me to look back on who I was and be very grateful for the experience that I had there for the time that I was there. I tell everybody I left when they started to try to decide how were we going to pay for coffee? And I was like, oh, I'm getting out of here. We did that before, and that was enough for me. But I hope you all will look at the names that I put up. I can't remember everybody's name that I gave a shout out to, but those were people who were there when I was there, who were instrumental in the development of the hotline, the ongoing development of the agency and organization itself. I think about Daisy, who was in charge of that CETA stuff, and I can't think of her last name, but she was a powerhouse sister. She had I think it was three outreach workers, and they went all over the city doing that work and did it well. So I think that's all that I want to say right now about my growth and development in WIT, and how good it's been for me. And just the fact that, I mean, we do have a panel of all white women. They were, because I declined to be on the panel. It's not because I wasn't asked, but the fact that you all did some good things, at least for me, and I'm pretty sure for the rest of the Black women too. Thank you so much for letting me say what I had to say.
Thank you, Carolyn. So just to say the names out loud, they are in the chat, but let's shout out Taliba Broughton-White, Carmen Salas, Sandra Boston, Gwen Brown, Shirley Chester, Linda Butler-Collins, Brenda Jones, Cindy Perkis, and Shirley Rubin. Thank you, Carolyn. Does anybody else want to speak to their feminist consciousness? Take it away, Miriam.
One of the struggles we had early on, and precipitated by Jennifer Fleming again, was that her version of feminism was that no men were allowed, ever, anywhere, no men. And I think this included the mailman. I think we had to have a system where he dropped the mail off down at the bottom of the steps, because she didn't want him crossing our threshold, nor did she want my 8-year-old son coming to the office. I didn't like that at all. And I thought we had to find a way, I had to find a way to be more inclusive with my feminism. I had to find a way to include the men in my life. And it was not going to be easy, that's for sure, but it would be harder for me to say to my son, no, you can't come to my office. I just was not going to do that. So it taught me that I had to continue to fight for what I thought was right and call it feminism.
Thank you. So along the pathway, we went from services for women who are separated and getting divorced or recovering from a divorce to working with women who experienced intimate partner violence. And then we added in some services about harmful substance use. So how did those services develop? And were there any challenges in integrating these services within the people who were providing services at Women in Transition?
Hattie Kalish on the board was also on the board of Eagleville. And the substance abuse proposal was the first proposal that didn't actually grow so much out of the organic experiences of our work. And we had a lot to learn. It was very challenging. We had workshops on addiction. We were encouraged to go to open AA meetings, and there was a lot of discussion about alcohol in the organization. We also found that it was similar to the other services in that, once again, women's lives were different than men, and that they suffered from shame, from sometimes drank from being abused, all kinds of things that were similar to the other services that we had provided. So there was the advocacy for women with substance abuses, as well as the direct service, which I think is a theme that was so important to women in transition. It was never just about the services. It was about what we call PIE, public information education that changes our culture for the better for women. That's okay. Others.
I wanted to say, I can remember how we got into the drug and alcohol portion. Again, I mean, I always experienced as we were always searching for the next grant. We were very dependent on where the next dollars were coming from. And so, and also the hotline was getting a lot of calls from women who were struggling with alcohol along with other things. So that feedback into the agency and the organization gave us some sense of perhaps where we needed to go. I have some humorous memories about when we got into it. Someone mentioned Beverly Harper early on. Beverly did the PR for that. We had Lynn, I'll think of her name, the singer we did a poster with a very famous Black singer, I can't think of her name, who eventually committed suicide because of drugs and alcohol. But for us and for me, I mean, we at that time, by that time, I think we were like at 8th and Chestnut or somewhere down around there. And the State Store was right around the corner. And it was the holiday time. And you know, we were all getting ready for the holidays, run out to the state store at lunchtime, bring your stuff, put it back under the desk to take home. Nothing, nobody was drinking in the office. And we had the new DNA staff coming on board. And I never forget when the staff member said to me, Carolyn, you can't have that in here. We're now serving women with a addiction problems. And she explained the whole, I thought I would die. I was like, oh my God, I never thought about it. But those kinds of personal awakenings we had when we started that, I think that brought a lot of attention to a lot of things. I myself went to an open AA meeting and really realized I probably needed to join at that time, but I didn't, but at least I knew. Marita Jarvis, I think her name was the AA counselor for women in transition. Marita saved my mother's life. I brought my mother into Marita, and Marita set it up so she got 28 days of whatever people weren't getting 28 days of. She went into care, came out, and my mother died sober. That's one of the things, that's it. That's one of the things that women in transition did for my life as well. I mean, that was some serious business. And there were things when we went into that program, again, things about drugs and alcohol that I just never knew, and the trainings we had. And Sandra Boston, I believe, because most of the trainings that were really, really good had to do with Sandra. I think she was involved in that too. And I wish I could think of the young lady's name. My memory is my issue here, late. Somewhere in my lifetime, that was the song she sang. And if I find it on my phone, I'll tell you. But anyway, that was who Beverly brought to us for that program. And like I said, there were some serious moments, but there were also some funny ones, like take the alcohol from under your desk, girl. You can't do that. That was very funny. I had a good time with that one. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. So I'd just like to remind everyone in the audience that you can submit your questions for the panel through the Q&A box. So we talked about a bunch of different kinds of inclusivity, but we haven't really specifically called out very much the sexual orientation inclusiveness and the number of lesbians and bisexual women who've been involved in women in transition. So I know that we had an initiative in the 90s, specifically trying to bring in lesbian survivors. And I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit. And there's Roberta.
Well, you know, a lot of what we did with this started through the substance abuse program. We started something called Lesbians in Sobriety. And that was such an incredibly popular group. It was just amazing. And so we also decided then through that group, suggested that we try to do a hotline. And we did. It was unfortunate that it didn't take off. We had partnered with a number of different local agencies in the lesbian, gay, etc. community. And we had this specific line set up, but we'd answer it, I think daytime, can't remember. But it was really important. It was really important that we did that.
Thanks. So now that we're kind of at the end of our time, I'm going to sandwich two questions together because I don't want to just end on a kind of down note. So you can choose to answer whichever one you prefer to answer. One question that was suggested to sort of surface some of the things that had gone on so that other people can learn from mistakes was, what were some mistakes you made? And if you'd like to answer a different question, what do you hope to see WIT do in the future? So I'm going to open it up for everyone again.
Could you say that last one again? What do you hope
Sure.
to
What do you hope to see WIT do in the future?
Oh.
What was the, I'm sorry, Zoe, what was the first one?
The first one was, what were some mistakes you made? If you'd like to surface something for other people's learning benefit.
I just hope WIC keeps going and going. I think some of the new programs that WIC's offering now are incredible. The Bicycle Coalition, I can't remember what that's called. Then the
Gearing Up.
I'm sorry?
Gearing Up is
Yes,
the bicycle
Gearing
program.
Up, yes. And the self-help group is so incredibly important.
Zoe, for those of us who worked some time ago, could you simply say some of the new things that Women in Transition is doing?
Sure. So fairly recently, we have made our services inclusive of people of all gender identities. We have revived the WAVE Empowerment Self-Defense Program. We've added Gearing Up as a program, which is going to be doing bicycling events with people in recovery. We have a therapist on staff now who's providing trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, in addition to our domestic violence counselors who are providing that help with safety planning and advocacy across systems and case management and stuff like that. We still have our Lifeline, which operates Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. So we have our in-house counseling line. We staff the Collaboration for Agency Philadelphia Domestic Violence Hotline. We do financial education workshops. We have occupational therapists come in and do Vocation Station, where we help folks learn skills for getting a new job or, advancing their career. We have a lot of different kinds of programs that are being added, every day.
Wow, that sounds amazing, inspiring, really wonderful. Thank you to everybody who's working at WIC now.
Oh, my bad. I forgot. We still have recovery services. So not only do we have one-on-one counseling in the office, we have a counselor who goes to recovery houses and runs groups there. And then we also have a group called Safe and Sober that we run a bunch of times a year at WIC.
I am so impressed with how WIT, or Women in Transition, has grown to really respond to the needs that come out as time goes on. To think of 50 years, and it's still a vibrant, empowering feminist group. It's quite an accomplishment to have done that. And so those who set down the foundation did a great job, and all of you who have led it, going into the future, are just to be commended.
I would hope, yes, this is Carolyn again. I would hope for the future that Women in Transition would be as mindful and dedicated to making itself available and real in the lives of all women, and to do the outreach that we used to do to the women who were in low economic situations, that, I don't know, perhaps you do, I didn't hear you say, I'm not sure, which programs that you take out of the building and into the community, because I remember wherever we were, oftentimes the location was a challenge to the women to have to ride to somewhere or come downtown or whatever. So getting out into community through whatever means necessary is really important in terms of the kinds of services that you offer. The political is the personal. Something quietly connected to voter registration is really important, and I think helping women to understand why we play a big part in that, and just those kind of basic things, and basic to, as I say, all women, because I hear a lot about the substances, but they're those old things that still remain issues for all women, that I would hope we continue to provide services for them. and come out of that building wherever you are. I know you're down here somewhere, and go to where the women are. So
I want to say to that, Carolyn, Irene Lindsay Brantley, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but she is a program director at WIT, and she has been doing a Zoom support group for, I don't even know, for last year or so. And I periodically talk to her, and she has told me how powerful that Zoom is, because women have come to that meeting from all over the country. And
go ahead, Roberta.
I think she froze.
Oh, well, I would about that. See, I'm not anti-techie. That's what I started to say. But that's for women who have computers and can Zoom. Some of the women that I'm talking about don't have the benefit of computers. You got to meet them at the church across the street or some building where they gather, because they don't have benefit of a computer and Zoom. And we were real good at that back in the day. So that's my.
I agree with you.
That's my.
I think that's the move, is definitely to meet people where they're at.
That's it.
All right. So thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate you being here tonight to have this conversation with us. And thank you to all of the people who attended. If you, as a member of the audience, are a part of WIT History and you'd like to be interviewed for the Oral History Project, please contact Blanche Brown, and we're going to put her email into the chat for you so that you can reach out to her. And then that oral history becomes part of our WIT archive. So we are hanging on to, as much of this material as we can, so that 50 years from now, when we celebrate our 100th anniversary, people will be able to hear about where it all began. Does anybody have any last closing remarks that they'd like to make?
I'd like to, go ahead, Roz.
Yes, thank you for organizing this and for reaching out to different people. I appreciate being able to share some of my own experience and hearing so much from these other women on the panel, and including Carolyn. It's really been a treat. Thank you.
I wanted to say that I knew 50 years ago that the reason I was working at Women in Transition was because I believed in the cause, and I still do. And I'm very proud to have been a part of it way back when, and to have this opportunity now, Roz, as you said, to look back and see, hey, we did that. Feels good.
I'm so proud of how the services have evolved. They're similar in many ways, but they've evolved to be relevant now. And one of them is the Me Too. The fact that you're talking about boundaries and relationships in the military, in the classroom, in all kinds of places for women, just shows how flexible and creative Women in Transition really is. And I'm so proud of you.
All right, thank you so much for being here. There was one question in the Q&A, and that was, how do we donate? And the answer is, if you would like to make a donation to Women in Transition, you can go to our website at helpwomen.org, and there's a page to donate. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this event, and we hope to see you at the next one.